History is filled with bizarre ways to keep meat from rotting, some real, some pure myth. From using ancient embalming fluids to mummifying meat to fresh meat buried deep in the desert sand, people have tried it all. Here are 20 ways how the Egyptians preserved their meat without refrigeration. Mummification for the afterlife. If you know about how human bodies are mummified, then this shouldn't come as a surprise to you. In ancient Egypt, food was more than just sustenance. It was a gift to the gods, a source of power, and most importantly, a necessity for the afterlife. While the living relied on salting, drying, and smoking to preserve their food, the dead required a more elaborate approach. Meat preservation for the afterlife followed the same principles as mummifying a human body. Egyptians believed that the deceased would need food in the next world, and to ensure that, they perfected a method to keep meat intact for eternity. The process began with natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture abundant in Egypt. Just as human bodies were dehydrated with natron to prevent decay, so was meat intended for burial. Cuts of beef, duck, and even fish were packed in natron, drawing out all moisture and halting bacterial growth. Once fully dried, the meat was sometimes coated in resins or spices, which acted as an additional preservative and provided an offering-worthy fragrance. The final step was wrapping the preserved meat in linen bandages, mimicking the way a pharaoh's body was wrapped before burial. These preserved meats were placed in tombs alongside bread, fruits, and jugs of beer or wine, ensuring the deceased had all the essentials for a comfortable afterlife. Some of the most famous preserved meat offerings have been discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun, where joints of meat wrapped in linen were buried with the young king. The fact that these food items remained intact for thousands of years proves how effective this method was. Burial in sand. The Egyptian desert was more than just an unforgiving landscape. It was also a natural preservation tool. In extreme cases, meat was buried in deep layers of hot, dry sand, where the heat and arid conditions acted as a natural dehydrator. This method works similarly to sun drying, but instead of direct sunlight, the sand absorbed moisture from the meat, while shielding it from scavengers and insects. The burial process was straightforward. Meat was wrapped in linen or palm leaves, then placed in deep sand pits where it was completely covered. The sand, warmed by the intense desert sun, drew moisture from the meat, leaving it dry and resistant to bacterial growth. In some cases, heated stones were added to the pit to speed up the drying process, ensuring the meat was preserved as quickly as possible. Hunting parties used this method frequently, as it allowed them to store excess meat in remote locations without carrying bulky storage containers. When travelers ventured deep into the desert, they buried meat along their route, returning later to retrieve it when food supplies were low. Egyptian soldiers stationed in distant outposts sometimes relied on this technique, particularly in times when fresh meat was scarce. While burial in sand was effective, it was primarily a short-term preservation method. The meat needed to be retrieved within a certain time frame before it became too brittle or lost too much of its nutritional value. Nomadic tribes and desert-dwelling communities used this technique not only in Egypt, but throughout North Africa and the Middle East, proving its effectiveness in dry, arid climates. Using beer and wine. Beer was one of the most widely consumed beverages in ancient Egypt, and beyond being a beloved drink, it was sometimes used to preserve meat. Egyptians discovered that soaking meat in beer or wine slowed bacterial growth, as the alcohol content acted as a mild preservative, reducing oxidation and limiting microbial activity. While this method was not as widely used as salting or drying, it was likely reserved for special occasions, feasts, and temple offerings. The process involved submerging cuts of meat in ceramic vessels filled with beer or wine, ensuring that the alcohol fully covered the surface of the meat. Over time, The alcohol inhibited bacterial growth and infused the meat with a unique flavour. In some cases, spices and herbs were added, creating a marinated effect that further improved both taste and preservation. This method was most commonly found in royal kitchens and temple storerooms. Pharaohs and noble families occasionally prepared beer-soaked meats for lavish feasts, especially during big celebrations, religious festivals, and victory banquets. Priests overseeing temple offerings used alcohol-soaked meats for divine sacrifices, believing that the preservation method honoured the gods. Wealthier households may have stored beer-preserved meats in sealed clay jars, ensuring that they had flavoured meats ready for important gatherings. However, because beer and wine were not as strong as modern alcohol-based preservatives, this method was likely used for short-term preservation rather than long-term storage. For elite traders and merchants, alcohol preservation became a way to extend the freshness of rare meats imported from Nubia or the Levant. Because these meats were difficult to acquire and expensive, using beer or wine helped maintain their quality until they could be consumed. Salting. The Egyptian sun was unforgiving and fresh meat spoiled quickly under its intense heat. Without refrigeration, people needed a reliable way to preserve food for extended periods. Salt was the answer. Found in abundance along the banks of dry lake beds and the Wadi Natrun, salt, especially natron, became a vital part of daily life. The Egyptians quickly realized that coating meat in salt pulled out moisture, preventing bacterial growth and extending its shelf life for weeks, if not months. The process was simple, but required precision. Butchers and temple workers prepared fresh cuts of cattle, fish, and fowl, carefully slicing the meat into pieces that allowed salt to penetrate deeply. Each cut was packed in thick layers of natron, left to cure under the shade of storage rooms. The salt would draw out moisture, leaving behind meat that was dry, firm, and resistant to decay. Some meats were also rubbed with aromatic herbs like coriander, cumin, and fenugreek, enhancing flavour and further aiding in preservation. Pharaoh's kitchens, temple priests, and common traders all relied on salted meats. For royal feasts, preserved meats were stored in massive ceramic jars, ready to be rehydrated and cooked when needed. Soldiers carried salted beef and fish into battle, providing essential nourishment on long campaigns. Traders sailing down the Nile transported barrels of salted fish, ensuring a steady supply of protein for months. Even pyramid builders at Giza were fed dried, salted meats to keep them strong for their grueling work. This method of preservation was so effective that it continues to influence modern food practices. Today's cured meats, such as jerky, salted cod, and biltong, follow the same principles developed thousands of years ago in the deserts of Egypt. Smoking. While salting was effective, the Egyptians found a way to make preserved meat even more durable and flavourful by smoking it over open flames. This method not only prolonged the meat's shelf life, but also infused it with rich, smoky flavours. Egyptian butchers, fishermen, and soldiers came to rely on smoking as a key part of meat preservation, ensuring they had food that would last through long journeys and harsh conditions. Smoked meats were essential for Egyptian armies. Before an extended military campaign, soldiers were issued rations of smoked beef and fish, packed into clay jars and carried on carts across the desert. These rations remained edible for weeks, providing crucial sustenance for battles far from the fertile lands of the Nile. Nile fishermen also used this method, allowing them to preserve their catch and sell smoked fish in bustling city markets. The process began with salting the meat first, as salt alone preserved the meat but left it susceptible to insects and pests. To further protect it, Egyptians hung strips of salted beef, fish and poultry over slow-burning fires made from palm fronds, acacia wood or reeds. The smoke carried natural compounds that coated the meat, creating a protective barrier against bacteria and pests. The longer the meat was smoked, the more resistant it became to spoilage. Temples and noble households used smoked meats in elaborate meals, often as gifts to high-ranking officials or as offerings to the gods. In fact, archaeologists have found remnants of smoked meats in tombs, preserved for the deceased to enjoy in the afterlife. Barbecue techniques, smoked sausages, and dried fish preservation all trace their origins to methods refined thousands of years ago along the banks of the Nile. Brining. Brining was one of the most effective ways ancient Egyptians preserved their meat, particularly larger cuts from cattle, goat, and fish. This method involves submerging meat in a saltwater solution, which not only prevented bacteria from thriving, but also helped retain moisture, making it more palatable after long storage periods. Unlike simple salting, which dried out meat, brining allowed meat to remain somewhat tender while still being preserved. This method was essential during times of food scarcity, such as after poor harvests or during military campaigns. Egyptian soldiers were given brined meat rations, allowing them to carry preserved food over long distances without the risk of spoilage. The process began with butchers preparing fresh cuts of meat, ensuring they were trimmed of excess fat, which could spoil faster. The meat was then placed in large ceramic vats filled with water drawn from the Nile, mixed with natron or rock salt. Over several days, the salt permeated the flesh, drawing out excess moisture and replacing it with a salty brine that acted as a natural preservative. Depending on the desired result, the meat could be left in the brine for different lengths of time, sometimes for weeks. Brining was particularly valuable for royal kitchens and temple offerings. Because pharaohs' feasts often required large quantities of meat, having a supply of preserved but still relatively tender cuts ensured that meals could be prepared efficiently. Fishermen also used brining, submerging freshly caught fish in brine to preserve them until they could be taken to markets or transported along trade routes. Modern techniques for curing hams, corned beef, and pickled fish are direct descendants of the methods developed by ancient civilizations like Egypt, proving that brining has stood the test of time. Fat sealing. For Egyptians seeking a method to store cooked meat without it spoiling, fat sealing, or meat preservation in rendered animal fat, offered an effective and reliable solution. By submerging cooked meat in hot fat, an airtight seal was created, protecting it from bacteria and oxidation. This method not only preserved the meat, but also enhanced its flavour, as it absorbed the rich, savoury qualities of the fat. Egyptians primarily used goat, sheep, or ox fat for this method. After the meat was cooked, usually roasted or slow simmered, it was packed into large earthenware pots. Melted fat was then poured over the meat, ensuring it was completely covered before the pot was sealed with linen cloth or a clay lid. As the fat cooled, it hardened into a protective barrier, locking out air and bacteria. This technique was widely used among soldiers and travellers, as it allowed meat to remain edible for weeks or even months without refrigeration. Caravans crossing the desert relied on fat-sealed meat to sustain them during long journeys. Temple kitchens stored sealed meats for ceremonial feasts, ensuring that there was always a supply of food for religious events. Even in common households, families who could afford larger quantities of fat used this method to ensure their food supply lasted through leaner months. Ceramic jar storage. Ancient Egyptians were skilled in the use of sealed ceramic jars for food storage, an essential method for preserving meat. This technique worked by creating an airtight environment that protected dried, salted, or fat-sealed meat from moisture, pests, and contamination. Archaeological discoveries have shown that these jars were widely used in homes, temples, and even tombs, proving their effectiveness in food preservation. The process started with preparing the meat. It was usually salted, sun-dried, or coated in fat before being packed into large clay vessels. These ceramic jars, known as amphorae or storage pots, were designed with narrow necks and wide bases, allowing them to be sealed tightly with clay lids, beeswax, or linen soaked in resin. This sealing method prevented air and moisture from entering, significantly extending the shelf life of the meat. These jars were stacked in cool, shaded storerooms, underground cellars, or temple granaries, keeping their contents safe from the heat, insects, and rodents. Royal kitchens used ceramic jars to store meats intended for elaborate feasts, ensuring a steady supply of provisions. Temples stored preserved meats in these jars for religious offerings, keeping food in pristine condition for extended ceremonies. For traders and travellers, ceramic jars made it possible to transport meat along trade routes without spoilage. Soldiers on military expeditions also carried meat sealed in jars, ensuring they had reliable rations during long campaigns in the desert. Even commoners used this method, burying sealed jars in the ground to keep their meat fresh for extended periods. This technique allowed Egyptians to control food supply, ensuring that seasonal meat harvests could be stored for later use. Without ceramic jars, much of their preserved meat would have been vulnerable to spoilage, proving this method was essential to their way of life. Air drying. While sun drying was common, ancient Egyptians also relied on air drying in shaded, well-ventilated areas to preserve meat. Unlike direct sun exposure, air drying prevented excessive heat from cooking the meat too quickly, allowing for a more controlled dehydration process. This method was particularly valuable for delicate meats, such as fish and poultry, as well as organ meats, which spoiled faster than muscle cuts. To air dry meat, Egyptians cut it into thin strips and hung them on wooden racks, or spread them over woven reed mats, in locations that received good airflow but limited direct sunlight. Some drying areas were built with high walls to block out strong sun rays, while still allowing warm desert breezes to circulate, creating natural drying chambers. This ensured that the meat lost moisture at a steady rate without overheating, reducing the risk of mold or spoilage. Workers at temple complexes and pyramid construction sites relied heavily on air-dried meats. Because large numbers of labourers needed sustained food supplies, dried meats were stored in clay jars and rationed out over time. Travellers moving across desert trade routes also carried air-dried meat, as it was lightweight, easy to transport, and required no additional preparation before eating. This method also had religious and ceremonial uses. Priests preparing for long temple festivals or burial rites stored air-dried meats alongside grains and beer in vast temple storehouses. These meats were often paired with dried fish and fruits, forming preserved food supplies that lasted for weeks or months. Air drying was particularly beneficial in humid months, when the risk of excessive spoilage increased. It was a low-maintenance and cost-effective technique that even poorer Egyptian households could practice, allowing them to save meat without the need for expensive ingredients like honey or fat. The principles of air drying continue today in methods like Italian bresaola, dried fish in many coastal cultures, and the production of beef jerky, all of which use the same fundamentals of controlled dehydration that Egyptians mastered thousands of years ago. Ash preservation. In the harsh Egyptian climate, where food spoiled rapidly, Egyptians turned to wood ash as an alternative preservation method. They discovered that coating meat in fine ash helped absorb moisture, repel insects, and prevent bacterial growth. The alkaline nature of ash created a hostile environment for decay, extending the shelf life of meat without excessive use of salt. For military campaigns, Egyptian soldiers travelling through desert terrain relied on ash-coated meat, which could be eaten as is or rehydrated before cooking. Merchants and caravan traders moving along Sinai and Nubian trade routes, used this preservation method to extend the freshness of their food supplies without carrying heavy storage containers. Ash preservation was not only a practical and accessible method for commoners, but it also proved valuable in regions where salt trade was expensive. The ability to preserve meat without refrigeration meant that Egyptians could store food more efficiently, reducing waste and ensuring a stable food supply even in remote areas. To use this method, meat was first cleaned and cut into thin portions, then coated entirely in a layer of wood ash, which acted as a natural drying agent. The ash absorbed excess moisture and formed a protective barrier against air exposure, slowing decomposition. Some households stored ash-covered meat in woven baskets or shallow clay containers, keeping it away from pests and humidity. This method was especially useful in desert regions and among nomadic travellers, where access to large quantities of salt or fat was limited. Hunters used ash preservation to store their meat for later consumption, as it required little preparation and could be done in the wild. Common labourers and farmers also used this technique, as it was an inexpensive way to preserve excess meat for future use. Pressed meat cakes. To ensure a reliable food supply for soldiers, merchants and pyramid workers, ancient Egyptians developed pressed meat cakes, a dense and compact food that provided high energy and long-lasting sustenance. These cakes were made by combining minced meat with grains, honey and rendered animal fat, then shaping the mixture into thick cakes that could be dried and stored for months without refrigeration. The preparation began with chopping or grinding fresh meat, which was then mixed with barley or emmer wheat, creating a nutrient-rich blend of protein and carbohydrates. Honey was often added to bind the mixture and provide natural antibacterial properties, while fat was included to seal in moisture and create an additional barrier against spoilage. The cakes were then pressed into small, thick patties and either sun-dried or slowly roasted over low heat, further removing moisture and preventing bacterial growth. This method was particularly valuable for Egyptian military forces, who required portable, long-lasting rations during campaigns in Nubia and the Levant. Caravan traders travelling across the desert also carried pressed meat cakes, as they provided a compact and lightweight food source that required no additional preparation. Labourers working on large-scale construction projects, such as the Great Pyramids, were often issued these cakes as part of their daily rations, ensuring they had enough energy to sustain their work. These meat cakes were also stocked in temple granaries and storerooms, where they were distributed during food shortages or times of famine. Because they were dense and nutritious, they became an ideal survival food during periods when fresh meat was unavailable. Even some noble households stored pressed meat cakes, using them as emergency provisions or for feeding servants. Pickling. Fishermen along the Nile relied on pickling to preserve their daily catches, ensuring fish could be stored for weeks without spoiling. Merchants and temple workers also benefited, as pickled meats could be transported across long distances and still remain edible. Pharaohs and noble families enjoyed delicately pickled poultry, often prepared by palace chefs for extended banquets. Even during Nile floods, when fresh meat was scarce, people could rely on stored pickled meat to sustain them. The scorching Egyptian heat posed a challenge for storing fresh meat, but Egyptians were resourceful. Pickling became a method of choice, using acidic liquids to extend the life of perishable foods. Vinegar and fermented brine, both widely used in ancient Egyptian kitchens, became powerful tools against spoilage. This method was particularly effective for fish and poultry, which spoiled faster than red meats. The process began with soaking cuts of meat in a salt-heavy brine made from Nile water and crushed natron. This solution started the preservation process, drawing out excess moisture while preventing bacterial growth. After brining, the meat was transferred to large ceramic jars filled with vinegar or naturally fermented liquids, sometimes mixed with garlic, coriander or fennel seeds for added flavour and antibacterial properties. The acidity of the liquid killed harmful microbes and created an environment where bacteria struggled to thrive. The same principles used by the Egyptians are found in modern pickled fish, corned beef and preserved sausages. Across the Mediterranean and Middle East, variations of this ancient technique continue to flavour traditional cuisines, proving that the Egyptians' knowledge of food preservation was far ahead of its time. Lactic acid fermentation. Ancient Egyptians developed lactic acid fermentation to preserve meat in a way that extended its shelf life while improving its flavour and digestibility. This method involved allowing beneficial bacteria to break down sugars in the meat, creating an acidic environment that prevented harmful bacteria from growing. Fermentation was particularly useful for preserving fish, poultry and ground meats, which spoiled faster than larger cuts of beef or goat. The process began with mincing or grinding meat, then mixing it with salt and grains like barley or emmer wheat. Salt helped inhibit spoilage while encouraging the growth of lactic acid bacteria, which naturally thrived in the Egyptian climate. The mixture was then packed into sealed clay pots or large amphorae, where it was left to ferment over several days or even weeks. The natural bacteria converted sugars into lactic acid, which lowered the pH and kept the meat from rotting. Some variations included spices such as coriander or cumin, which enhance flavour while adding additional antibacterial properties. This preservation method was essential for workers, soldiers and temple kitchens, where food needed to be stored for extended periods. Pyramid labourers were provided with fermented meat pastes, which were easy to transport and required no additional cooking. Priests overseeing religious ceremonies often stored fermented fish products in temple storerooms, ensuring they had food available for long festivals. The marketplaces of cities like Thebes and Memphis likely sold fermented meat products, which became an everyday staple for those who could not afford fresh meat regularly. By creating a preservation method that relied on natural bacteria rather than drying or salting alone, Egyptians expanded their ability to store meat safely. This process influenced later food preservation techniques across the Mediterranean, paving the way for fermented sausages, cured meats, and traditional fish sauces that still exist today. Underground storage. Egyptians understood that one of the best ways to preserve food was to keep it cool, and since there was no refrigeration, they used the earth itself as insulation. Underground storage pits or simple cellars provided a cooler, stable environment that slowed bacterial growth, preventing meat from spoiling too quickly. This method was especially useful when combined with salting, drying or brining, as it extended the effectiveness of those preservation techniques. For Egyptian merchants who traded along the Nile and across the Sinai Peninsula, underground pits provided a way to temporarily store meat while waiting for transport ships or caravan routes to be ready. In extreme cases, when droughts or floods threatened food supplies, underground storage helped sustain communities by keeping rations available for longer periods. To create these storage areas, Egyptians dug deep pits in shaded locations, sometimes reinforcing the walls with mud brick or stone to prevent collapse. In wealthier homes, storage areas were built underneath buildings or within courtyard enclosures, ensuring that meat was shielded from direct sun exposure. Some pits were lined with woven reeds or straw, adding further insulation against temperature fluctuations. Underground storage was also widely used in Egyptian religious practices. Priests in charge of sacred food offerings stored meats underground to prevent premature spoilage, ensuring that temple sacrifices remained fresh for extended ceremonies. Meats that had already been salted or brined were placed in ceramic jars or wrapped in linen bundles before being lowered into the storage pits. The layers of earth surrounding these underground spaces provided natural cooling, often reducing temperatures significantly compared to the heat above ground. This storage method was essential for large households, temple kitchens, and military supply depots,